The wagon wheels broke at the worst possible time. With a jolt that almost threw her from her seat, Emma Davis grabbed the wooden side rail as the front axle gave a terrible crack. The driver cursed under his breath, jumped from the bench, and disappeared around the side, leaving her alone on the tilted bench in the middle of nowhere. Dust hung thick in the Wyoming air. The road was little more than a sun-baked trail surrounded by dry grass, a scattering of pine trees, and sky so big it felt like God himself could see straight through you. Emma squinted into the distance, the far-off outline of Clearview barely visible through the shimmer of heat and dirt. She held her bag tighter in her lap. Inside were 3 dresses, a small Bible, and a letter folded so many times it had worn soft at the corners. Thomas Fletcher's handwriting was plain and direct. "I'm a practical man, Miss Davis. I have 2 young ones, a ranch that needs tending, and no time for courtship. If you're willing, I'll have the preacher ready the day you arrive." She had read it 100 times, but it never felt so final as now, stranded miles outside the town with the sun baking her bonnet and nowhere else to go. The driver reappeared, wiping his forehead with a dirty rag. Wheels shot. "I can get you to town, but we'll have to walk the horse." Emma nodded silently, climbed down with more dignity than her stiff back allowed, and began to walk beside the creaking wagon. Her boots kicked up dust, her legs ached, but she didn't complain. Not when she'd crossed 4 states by train, then 2 days of wagon on rough country roads. This was the last mile. What waited at the end? A husband she'd never met, a new name, a life she hadn't chosen but had agreed to. Because the factories back in Ohio had broken her fingers and her hope, because a woman alone had few good choices. Because she dared to believe that maybe, just maybe, someone out west needed her. By the time they reached Clearview, the sun had dipped low, casting gold across the cracked wooden storefronts and crooked fence lines. It wasn't a town so much as a gathering, a feed store, a blacksmith, a church without a bell, and one man waiting on the porch of the livery with his arms crossed. That had to be him. Thomas Fletcher looked exactly as she imagined, broad-shouldered, sunburned, with sleeves rolled to his elbows and dirt under his fingernails. But the moment he saw her, his face gave away nothing. No smile, no greeting, just a stiff nod. "You Emma Davis?" he asked. She smoothed her skirt and stepped forward. "Yes, sir." He glanced at the driver, at the broken wagon. "Trouble?" "Nothing serious," the driver replied. "She's here now." Emma waited, but no hand was offered, no welcome to Clearview. Just a grunt and a turn of his heel. "Well," Thomas said over his shoulder, "you'd best come on then. I've got stew on the stove and kids to settle." That was how it began. No flowers, no first glance worth remembering. Just a woman in worn boots following a man she was meant to marry, and realizing step by step that something was terribly off. The house was sturdy, built from rough pine with a garden patch out front, and 2 goats penned near the porch. Chickens scattered as they approached. The moment Emma stepped inside, the scent of onions and boiled meat filled her nose. It wasn't unpleasant, but it wasn't inviting either. 2 small children sat at the table, staring wide-eyed. The girl, maybe 6, had tangled blonde curls and a smudge across her cheek. The boy, not more than 3, clutched a wooden spoon like it was a weapon. "This is Miss Davis," Thomas said flatly. "She'll be staying." The girl blinked. The boy shoved the spoon in his mouth. Emma tried to smile. "Hello, darlings." Neither answered. Thomas ladled stew into bowls, set them down with a dull thud, and gestured for her to sit. They ate in silence. No grace, no questions. The only sounds were chewing and the ticking of a small mantel clock above the hearth. Finally, Emma set her spoon down. "Mr. Fletcher," she said carefully, "I was under the impression we'd have some time to get to know one another before the wedding," he interrupted, not unkindly. "Ain't much to know. You'll handle the house and the children. I'll tend the ranch. You'll find me decent enough if you do your part." Emma stared at him. Her chest felt tight. "You speak of this like a contract." He shrugged. "Ain't it? You came here for a place. I offered it." "A place isn't a person," she said softly, "and I'm not a mule." Thomas frowned. "I lost my wife 2 winters ago. My daughter needs a woman's hand. My boy barely speaks. I don't have time for soft words or courtship. The children were still eating, silent as shadows. And what do I need? She asked, voice rising just slightly. Do you care? Thomas's eyes narrowed. You answered my letter. Emma stood. Her legs trembled from travel, from exhaustion, from a sense of shame she hadn't earned. I came here hoping for more than work and obligation. I hoped I might be treated like a person, a woman, not hired help with a ring. Thomas said nothing. I won't marry you, Emma said clearly. Not tomorrow, not like this. The words hung heavy in the air. The girl stared at her with wide eyes. The boy dropped his spoon. Thomas stood slowly. You'd rather walk back to the train? I'd rather sleep under the sky than in a house without respect. She left the table, stepped out into the cooling evening air. The wind had picked up, rustling dry grass across the fields. A few townspeople watched her pass with curious eyes from porches and lantern-lit windows. She walked past the edge of town, back to the church she'd seen earlier, a weathered, paint-stripped place with an old caretaker's shed behind it. She sat on the porch steps and closed her eyes. She didn't cry, she had no tears left after Ohio, but she did pray, not for rescue, but for the strength to start anyway. Tomorrow she would find somewhere to stay. Tomorrow she would begin again, not as a wife, not as a servant, but as herself. The morning after her refusal was colder than expected. A dry wind swept across the plains, stirring dust and brittle leaves, and Emma Davis sat hunched on the front steps of the old church caretaker's cottage, arms wrapped around her shawl. She hadn't slept much. The cotton side was hard, the blankets thin, and the wind howled through the cracks in the wood. But it was a roof, and more than that, it was hers, if only for the night. She watched the sun rise in slow streaks over Clearview, casting long shadows across the main road. Already the town was waking, a man hauling hay past the livery, a woman sweeping the front porch of the general store. No one stopped to gawk, but Emma felt their glances quick and sideways. She was the mail-order bride who turned her heels on a good man's offer. That was the story already forming in the whispers. She didn't care, not entirely, only a little. A creaking sound interrupted her thoughts, and she looked up to see widow Mary Wilson walking toward her with a bundle in her arms. Mary was tall and thin as fence wire, her gray hair pulled into a sharp twist at the back of her head. She wore a dark shawl and the kind of boots that said she knew mud better than marble. Her eyes sharp as needles missed nothing. Well, Mary said, setting the bundle down beside Emma, you didn't run off in the night. That's a start. I didn't plan to, Emma replied. Didn't figure you did. Only cowards run, and you don't strike me as one. Emma said nothing. Mary crouched down, untying the bundle, a loaf of bread, a jar of beans, a worn bar of soap, and a pair of wool socks. Thank you, Emma said quietly. Mary shrugged. Lord knows I've seen worse come through here. Girl's barely old enough to hold a pan. Coming west to save some man's soul or raise his chickens. You're older. Got grit. That's rare. I didn't mean to make trouble. You didn't. Mary straightened, hands on hips. You did what most don't dare. Stood up and said no. Of course they'll say you're proud or foolish. Maybe both. But that doesn't make it wrong. Emma looked down at her hands. Her fingers were red and raw from travel and cold. I don't know what I'll do now. Mary's voice softened. You'll live. Start there. There's always work for a steady pair of hands. You sew? I used to before the factory closed before I left. Well, come by the church on Thursday. Ladies gather there to quilt and gossip. You can listen or stitch. Your choice. Just don't sit here waiting for kindness to find you. You'll wait forever. And with that, Mary turned and walked back toward town, leaving Emma with her bundle and a strange flicker of hope in her chest. By midday, Emma had swept out the cottage with a broken broom she found behind the church. She folded her dresses into the corner, made tea from dry leaves she found in her bag, and pulled out her embroidery needle still tucked in the lining of her bag. Her fingers remembered the rhythm. Up, over, pull. The thread slid clean through cloth. It was the first thing that felt like hers in days. The next morning, she visited the general store. It was a squat building with shelves crammed full of everything from flour to nails to patent medicines. The owner, Mr. Parker, eyed her cautiously but said nothing as she asked for scrap cloth, offering to trade a day's stitching for whatever he had. By the time she left, he'd promised to ask his wife about old linens needing repair. Later that week, Emma sat in the back of the church while the Clearview Ladies' Sewing Circle gathered in tight knots. Their voices rose and fell like wind through wheat, sharp, rustling, sometimes cutting. She didn't speak, just stitched. But Mary sat beside her and offered quiet commentary under her breath. Who made the best jam? Who overwatered their roses? And which woman's quilt square was always crooked? No one said a cruel word to Emma's face, but the silence around her was deliberate, a test. She passed it by staying still and working fast, and by the end of the session, one woman even asked if she might repair a torn sleeve. That night, she walked back to the cottage with the sleeve folded neatly in her hand and a few coins in her pocket. Small, yes, but hers. The next morning brought a surprise. As she stepped outside with her teacup, she saw Sarah standing near the edge of the garden patch, barefoot, dress wrinkled, curls tangled. The child held something in her hand. Emma set her cup down and walked forward slowly. "Good morning, Sarah," she said softly. The girl didn't speak but extended her hand. In it was a tiny cluster of wildflowers, mostly stems and weeds, but tied with a piece of twine. "For you," the child mumbled. Emma knelt. "Thank you. These are beautiful." Sarah shifted on her feet. "Jake says you're a witch." Emma blinked. "And what do you say?" "I think witches don't sew or make soup or find lost children." Her voice wavered. "I heard Papa say you saved us." "I tried," Emma whispered. "I was scared too." Sarah looked down. "Do you hate him?" "No," Emma said gently, "but I don't want to marry someone who doesn't see me." Sarah frowned. "I see you." Emma felt her throat tighten. She reached out and tucked a loose curl behind the child's ear. "That means more than you know." When Sarah ran off, Emma stayed there kneeling, fingers still wrapped around the little bouquet. The wind picked up, colder than the day before, but it didn't matter. Something small had shifted. She belonged nowhere, yet she was beginning to matter somewhere. And somewhere not far from town, Thomas Fletcher stood at the edge of his field, hat in hand, staring toward the horizon. The barn needed mending, the calves were growing restless, and the house was quiet in a way he hadn't noticed before. The space Emma had briefly filled now echoed, and he felt it more than he expected. Back at the cottage, Emma opened the door, placed the flowers in an old jar, and set them on the windowsill. They didn't last long, but that wasn't the point. They'd been offered, and next Thursday she planned to speak first. The storm rolled in just after dusk, crawling over the western ridge with bruised clouds and wind that whistled through the narrow lanes of Clearview, like it had something to prove. Rain hadn't touched the town in weeks, and now it came all at once. Sheets of it, cold and angry, lashing the rooftops and rattling windows. Emma was in the cottage mending a boy's jacket from the Parker family, her lamp flickering each time the wind surged against the glass. She'd grown used to the silence of her evenings, just the scratch of thread and the occasional creak of the old floorboards. But tonight something felt wrong, uneasy. She stood, walked to the window, and pulled the curtain back just as a sharp knock landed on her door. It was Mary, soaked to the bone, her scarf flapping wildly around her neck. "Emma," she said breathless, "the Fletcher children, they're missing, went out before supper. Thomas thought they were in the barn. They didn't come back." The words sliced through Emma like a wire pulled tight. "Missing," she repeated. "They were seen heading toward the ridge, looking for that dog that's been running loose. It's nearly dark. Thomas is out with lanterns, but he's just one man." Emma didn't wait. She grabbed her coat, the heavy wool one she'd almost left behind in Ohio, and shoved her feet into her boots. No hesitation, no time for fear. Outside, the rain had turned the road into slush. The air smelled of mud and pine and danger. Mary handed her a spare lantern and pointed toward the woods. "I'll take the north fields," Mary said. "You check the creek trail. They like to follow the water." Emma nodded and plunged into the dark. The forest pressed in quickly, trees creaked in the wind, branches clawed at her coat, and the rain felt like needles on her skin. but she moved forward, calling their names softly at first, then louder. Sarah! Jake! Thunder cracked overhead. The lantern flame danced wildly, casting long, misshapen shadows across the trail. Her boots slipped more than once on the muddy ground. Her heart pounded, not from exertion, but from dread. She thought of Sarah's small hand offering flowers, of Jake's silence, of how brittle and young they were. What if they were cold? What if they'd fallen? She forced herself not to think of the worst. Then, faintly, barely above the wind, she heard something, a whimper. Emma froze, listened. Sarah, she called. Another sound, closer now, a child's cough. She turned, cutting across the trail toward the sound. The trees thickened, and her lantern barely lit the path, but she didn't stop. Her skirt caught on a branch, tearing at the hem. She didn't care. And then, just beyond a clump of pine, she saw them huddled together beneath a half-fallen log soaked to the bone. Sarah's arms wrapped around Jake, who was shivering so hard his teeth chattered. "Oh, my darlings," Emma breathed, dropping to her knees. Sarah looked up, eyes wide and tearful. "We didn't mean to go far. We were just looking for Spot." "The dog, of course." "I know, sweetheart, I know." She pulled off her coat, wrapped it around both children, and held them close. They were freezing. She could feel it through the wool. "Can you walk?" she asked gently. Sarah nodded. Jake didn't, but he clung to her, burrowing into her chest. Emma stood slowly, hoisting Jake into her arms and guiding Sarah with her free hand. The trail back felt longer, darker. Every step was slow, careful, but they kept moving, and the children leaned into her warmth like flowers toward the sun. By the time the clearing came into view, a lantern was swinging madly in the distance. Thomas! "Emma!" His voice cracked through the rain. "We're here!" she shouted back. He came running, mud up to his knees, panic etched across his face. When he saw them, both children wrapped in her coat. Emma staggering from the weight and the storm, his knees nearly gave out. He took Jake from her arms, pressed the boy to his chest. Sarah reached for her father, but then turned back to Emma and grabbed her hand. "She found us," the girl said. "She kept us warm." Thomas looked at Emma. His face was soaked, but it wasn't the rain that made his eyes shine. "Thank you," he said, voice broken. Emma nodded, too exhausted to speak. Her arms ached, her feet burned, but she was upright and the children were safe. The next morning dawned pale and quiet. The storm had passed, leaving puddles in the road and a soft mist curling through the grass. Emma rose late, her limbs sore from the night before. She half expected the world to move on, as it always did. But just after noon there was a knock at her door. Sarah stood there, clean-faced and holding a small bundle. "These are for you," she said shyly, handing it over. Inside were warm biscuits wrapped in a towel and a tiny wooden carving of a bird. "Papa helped me make it," she added. Emma crouched. "It's beautiful. You did this yourself?" Sarah nodded. "I wanted you to have something because you didn't have to come, but you did." "I'll always come for you," Emma said, surprising herself with how true the words felt. That evening, Thomas came too, awkward, holding a sack of apples, shifting his weight like a schoolboy. He didn't step inside, just stood on the porch. "I was wrong," he said after a long pause. "I treated you like a solution, not a person." Emma looked at him evenly. "Yes, you did. But you saved my children, and I can't forget that." She waited. "I don't know what comes next," he added, "but I wanted to say thank you, and if there's anything you need, anything, I'd like to be the one to help." Emma didn't smile, but she nodded. "Start with mending that fence behind the garden," she said. "It's leaning." And for the first time, Thomas laughed. Just once, low and quiet, but it was real. As he walked away, Emma looked at the wooden bird resting on her windowsill and thought, maybe for the first time since arriving, that she'd landed somewhere worth staying, somewhere she hadn't come to marry, but somewhere she was slowly beginning to belong. The days after the storm passed quietly, as if the land itself needed to recover. The roads dried in patches. The sky stayed a soft silver, and for the first time since she'd arrived, Emma felt the rhythm of Clearview settle into her bones. Her hands stayed busy. There were more mending jobs now, more women from town stopping by the cottage with skirts needing stitching or linens to be hemmed. They stayed longer than before, too, talking more, watching her more closely. Something in them had changed since the night she brought Thomas's children back from the woods. They still called her Miss Davis, but there was respect in the way they said it now, sometimes even warmth. The garden behind the cottage had started to green. Mary had dropped off a box of seeds. Leftovers from my spring planting, she'd said with a wink, and Emma had taken to them eagerly. Tomatoes, beans, radish, herbs. Her hands had forgotten how good it felt to work the soil. It was nothing grand, but it was hers. A place where she decided what grew, what stayed, what thrived. She was outside that Saturday afternoon, knelt in the dirt pulling weeds, when she heard soft footsteps approach. She didn't look up until she caught a shadow out of the corner of her eye. Sarah stood there holding a tin pail with both hands. "I brought eggs," the girl said. "Papa said you'd probably run out." Emma rose, wiping her hands on her apron. "That's thoughtful of you. Thank you." Sarah hesitated. "He carved something else, too, but he's too shy to give it to you." Emma raised an eyebrow. "Thomas Fletcher. Shy?" Sarah nodded solemnly. "When he's not mad, he gets quiet, like he's afraid he'll say the wrong thing." Emma took the pail and gestured toward the porch. "Would you like some lemonade?" Sarah lit up. "Yes, please." They sat together in the shade, sipping slowly. Sarah talked more now about school, about the neighbor's cat that stole their bread, about Jake's growing obsession with rocks. Emma listened with half a smile, marveling at how much this child had blossomed in just a few weeks. Her voice no longer trembled, her shoulders no longer slouched. When Sarah left, skipping down the path, Emma found a small wooden flower resting beneath the folded towel in the egg pail, sanded, smooth, simple, with a tiny E carved into one petal. That evening, Thomas came by. He stood at the edge of the garden like he wasn't sure how close he was allowed to get. Emma straightened from where she was stacking kindling and gave him a nod. "I see the eggs made it," he said. "They did. I'm teaching Sarah to sand the wood now. Helps keep her hands busy." "She talks more too," Emma said, folding her arms. Thomas looked down. "That's you. She never spoke much after her mother passed. She was quiet for months. I used to think it was grief, but I think she just didn't feel safe." Emma waited. She didn't rescue him from the silence. He needed to walk through it himself. "I didn't mean to treat you poorly," he said at last. "I just didn't know how to ask for help without feeling weak, and I certainly didn't know how to offer anything a woman like you deserves." "What do you think I deserve, Thomas?" His eyes met hers steady. "Respect, kindness, a partner, not a servant." She said nothing for a long while. The sun was low, casting gold across the porch and catching in his hair. He looked older today, not tired exactly, but worn down at the edges. Honest. "I'm not ready to marry," she said quietly. "I'm not asking again. Not now," he replied. "I just want to sit if that's all right." She nodded, and he joined her on the step. They didn't speak for a long time. The wind rustled through the garden. Somewhere a cow lowed in the distance, and for the first time they sat together. Not as strangers, not as would-be spouses, but as two people choosing to be present. The next week brought something unexpected. Mrs. Parker, the storekeeper's wife, stopped by with a basket of torn linens and an offer. "Reverend Brown's organizing a harvest fair," she said. "First in 3 years with a quilt auction for the schoolhouse fund. Your stitching's finer than most. If you join the circle, I think it would help your place here." Emma accepted, not because she wanted to prove herself, but because it felt like something she could give. Every Tuesday evening, she joined the women at the church hall. Mary sat at her left, Mrs. Parker at her right, and one by one, more chairs filled. There was laughter, small stories, the occasional needle prick and curse word under breath. It wasn't home yet, but it wasn't exile either. One afternoon, she arrived early and found Sarah and Jake outside the church, sitting in the grass with a basket of sticks. "What are you two making?" she asked. "Nothing," Jake said. But Sarah grinned. "A surprise," she whispered. By now, the children had stopped treating her like a stranger. They waved when they saw her. Jake would reach for her hand on walks through town. Sometimes Sarah would bring her wild flowers and talk for a full hour without taking a breath. But that evening, something shifted. As Emma walked back from the church, the air sharp with the first whisper of autumn, she spotted something on her porch: a jar of apple butter, a folded blanket, and a single note. For the one who stayed, there was no name, but she knew. That night, Emma sat alone at her table, the wooden flower and the blanket side by side. She didn't need a proposal to understand what was being offered. Not marriage, not ownership, not obligation, a place, a peace. And in the weeks to come, that offering would be tested, not just by memories of what she left behind, but by someone from her past arriving with stories that threatened everything she was building. But for now, she simply let herself feel the quiet. The kind that didn't demand anything. The kind that felt like safety, like the beginning of home. It was a crisp morning when the man arrived, dressed in a long brown coat, too fine for travel but too worn for business. He stepped off the morning wagon with a bag in one hand and a familiar sort of confidence in the other, the kind that made people look twice without knowing why. Emma didn't see him arrive. She was in the back garden tending to her tomatoes, the ones just starting to fatten after weeks of careful care. The sun was warm on her shoulders, and a breeze carried the scent of wild sage from the hills. She didn't notice anything unusual until Mary appeared near the fence, arms crossed, eyes narrow. "You've got company," Mary said, "uninvited from the look of it." Emma wiped her hands on her apron and stood. "Who is it?" "Man claims to know you, said his name is Robert Greene." The name hit her like cold water. Robert, her late sister's husband, the man who'd once called her Mousy Emma when she wouldn't laugh at his crude jokes. The man who, after her sister's death, stood by with folded arms as their family demanded she stay and raise children that weren't hers. Emma felt the blood drain from her face. "What does he want?" Mary raised an eyebrow. "Better you ask him?" Inside the cottage, Robert stood just beyond the door, brushing invisible dust from his sleeve like he had a right to the room. "Emma," he said, voice low and slick, "you're a hard woman to find." "I wasn't hiding," she said, stepping inside, keeping the door open behind her. "I just left." Robert let out a humorless chuckle. "Call it what you like. You up and disappeared? Left the family high and dry?" "I left after you told me I had no use but watching someone else's children and mending your shirts. After you said I'd never marry unless someone was desperate enough to buy a bride." His smile faltered, but only slightly. "I was angry, grieving." "You were cruel." He dropped the charm. "Then I've got debts back home, Emma, and people are asking questions. Your name came up. The church ladies remember you leaving. Word got around you came out here with some farmer's money." Emma narrowed her eyes. "I didn't take a cent from Thomas. I turned down the marriage." He leaned forward, placing his hands on her table like he owned it. "Doesn't matter. People think you did. And I think maybe if I tell the story the right way, your little reputation here won't be so clean anymore." She stared at him, her mouth dry. "What do you want?" "A loan?" he said smoothly. "Just enough to cover a few things. I walk away, no trouble. You stay in your little garden paradise. No one has to know you're the kind of girl who runs from family." She almost laughed. "There is no family, Robert. You made sure of that." His eyes hardened. "Suit yourself, but don't expect the folks here to keep treating you like some angel once they hear how you abandoned your dead sister's kids and ran off like a thief in the night." He turned on his heel and walked out, tipping his hat to Mary as if they were in some social parlor. That afternoon, the whispers began. Subtle at first, a pause in conversation when she passed the general store, a glance too quick to be accidental. By the next morning, someone had written a word across the church steps in chalk. Liar. Mary found her there, scrubbing the stone clean with a bucket of soapy water. "You don't have to do that," Mary said. "Yes, I do." Mary watched her for a moment. "He's a vulture. They always circle when they smell change. And you've changed, Emma. You've got something worth picking at now." "I didn't expect it to hurt like this." Mary crouched beside her. "That's 'cause you care. Only people who build something real feel the sting when someone throws a rock at it." Later that day, as Emma walked toward the post office, she heard boots behind her and turned. Thomas stood there, jaw tight. Is it true? He asked, voice low. Which part? That man said you left children behind, that you ran from your family. Emma looked him in the eye. I left a house where I was nothing more than a servant. After my sister died, they said I owed it to them to stay forever. I cooked, cleaned, kept the peace. No one asked me what I wanted. Not once. So I left. I didn't have money or a plan, just the nerve to choose myself. Thomas didn't respond right away. Then he said, Why didn't you tell me? Because I was tired of explaining myself to men who already thought they knew who I was. He stepped closer. I don't think I know you, Emma, but I want to. That's the difference. She let out a breath. She didn't know she was holding. That man doesn't speak for me. Not now. Not ever. I believe you, Thomas said. But if he speaks again, I'll be the one who answers. That evening, Emma found Sarah waiting outside the cottage, arms crossed, brow furrowed. I heard Mrs. Turner say you were a liar, Sarah said. Are you? No, Emma said gently, but sometimes people lie about others to make themselves feel better. Sarah thought for a long moment. Then she held up a small stone, smooth and round. I saved this for you. It looks like an egg, but it isn't. It's a pretend one, so you always have something that won't break. Emma knelt down, tears stinging her eyes. That's the best gift I've ever been given. In the days that followed, the tide shifted. Robert didn't stay. Word got around that Thomas had met him behind the feed store and had a conversation that left Robert pale and quiet. He left town the next day, but the damage lingered. Not on Emma's reputation. Most had begun to rally behind her, but in her heart. The past had claws. It still knew how to find her. And yet, in the silence that followed, something stronger took root. Resolve. She hadn't run from Clearview. She hadn't bowed when shamed. And in the next chapter of her life, whatever it looked like, she would walk forward not with apology, but with purpose. Because if the past had followed her here, so be it. It would have to watch her stay. The first snow came early that year, dusting the rooftops of Clearview with soft white before the last of the pumpkins had even been cleared from porches. It blanketed the fields and muted the sound of everything: wagon wheels, barking dogs, gossip. The whole town seemed to breathe slower, like it was holding something inside. Emma stood at her window that morning, hands wrapped around a chipped mug of tea. The glass was fogged, the panes old and rattling with each gust. Outside, the garden slept beneath a thin crust of frost, the last of the radishes tucked into root cellars, the herbs long gone brittle. She liked this quiet. She'd earned it. But the knock on her door broke it clean in half. She opened it to find Thomas standing there, shoulders dusted in snow, his hands shoved deep into his coat pockets. I know it's early, he said, but I didn't want to wait. She stepped aside wordlessly and let him in. He took off his hat, set it gently on the table, and stood there as though unsure of what to do with himself. I've been thinking, he said. Always dangerous, she replied softly, trying to hide the way her pulse quickened. He smiled, but it was a nervous one. I've been watching you, not in a strange way, just watching how you are with the kids, with the garden, with folks who need help, and how you've handled this place, this whole town, like it's yours, even when it tried to spit you out. He cleared his throat, removed a folded piece of cloth from his coat, and laid it on the table. It was a small square of quilt stitched unevenly, but earnestly with red thread. A heart clumsy and honest. Sarah made that, he said. Said she wanted to put it in your pillow. Emma touched the cloth, her fingers lingering on the stitchwork. She told me last night she wants you to come home. Emma looked up. I thought I was already there. He stepped closer. Then maybe this is for me, not her. Thomas reached into his other pocket and pulled out something small, round, and silver. A ring. It wasn't fancy, it had no stone, but it was polished and warm from his hand. I'm not the man I was when you stepped off that wagon. You know that. And I know now what kind of woman I'm standing in front of. You're not a fix or a favor. You're a fire. You changed this town. You changed me. She swallowed hard. I won't ask you to marry me because I need you, he said. I'm asking because I want you as my equal, as my partner, as someone I admire more than anyone else I've ever met. Silence hung between them like breath in winter air. Then softly Emma said, "May I sit with you first?" Thomas blinked. "Sit? Before I say yes or no, I want to sit on the porch on the dirt. At dinner, through storms, through hard seasons. I want to see what it's like, truly like, to be with you without the shape of marriage around it." He nodded slowly. "You want time." "I want truth." He looked down at the ring, then slipped it back into his coat. "I'll wait as long as it takes." The next weeks passed like a shared breath. Thomas came most evenings, sometimes with the children, sometimes just to sit. He chopped firewood for her without asking. She taught him how to mend a button when his coat tore. They spoke about practical things, roof leaks, stew recipes, calf vaccines, and sometimes they didn't speak at all. They just existed together. One morning, Sarah showed up at the cottage door with a small basket of dried lavender and 2 cracked teacups tied together with twine. "For your porch talks," she said. Emma smiled, kneeling to hug the girl close. "You're a wise one." Sarah grinned. "I learned from you." Later that week, Reverend Brown asked Emma to read scripture at the town's winter gathering. It was a small gesture, but significant. The church had once been where her reputation was questioned. Now it welcomed her voice. She stood in front of a crowded room lit by oil lamps and breath fog and read Psalm 126. "They that sow in tears shall reap in joy." As she read, Thomas stood in the back, arms crossed, Sarah tucked beneath one elbow, Jake asleep on the other shoulder. Emma's voice did not waver. That night, after the church emptied, she stepped outside into the crisp dark. Snowflakes drifted down, catching in her hair. Thomas came out beside her quietly. "That was beautiful," he said. "It was true," she replied. They stood in silence for a moment, the sound of the world muffled by snow. Then she said, "Ask me again." His eyes searched hers. "Not right now," she added, "but when the thaw comes, when the land softens, when the rivers run again." He nodded once. "When you're ready, not before." She leaned her head against his shoulder. He didn't move. Didn't ask for more, just stood there, steady as the earth beneath them. In the months to come, that steadiness would matter. There would be fire, there would be risk. Emma didn't know it yet, but something in town would soon test all that had been built between her and Thomas, between her and the people of Clearview. But on that night, in the quiet hush of falling snow, all that mattered was this. She had not been chosen out of desperation. She had not stayed out of fear. She had not been given love. She had earned it, and she would walk forward on her own terms. The first spark came from the granary. It was midday, sky clear and windless, the kind of brittle winter day where even the birds were quiet. Emma was walking home from the schoolhouse with Sarah, who'd insisted on showing off her handwriting when a sharp, unnatural crack split the silence. It sounded like a tree branch snapping in a storm, only there was no wind. Then came the shouting. Smoke rose behind the feed store, thick, black, alive. Sarah dropped her notebook. Emma didn't even stop to think. She ran, skirts flying, boots skidding across the icy road. The fire had already taken hold by the time she reached the edge of the granary, licking up the dry boards like they were paper. Men shouted orders. Women carried buckets from the well in a frantic chain. Children stood crying on the sidelines, clinging to aprons and each other. Thomas was already there, his coat thrown off, soot across his forehead. He was swinging a pail of water toward the flames, yelling to Jake to stay by the fence. Emma rushed to his side. "Where's the Miller boy? I heard someone say he was inside." Thomas didn't hesitate. "I'll go." "No," she said, grabbing his arm. "You're too broad. You'll get stuck in that loft hatch. I'm smaller." Before he could argue, she pulled a scarf over her mouth and ducked beneath the sagging doorway. The heat hit like a slap. Smoke clawed at her lungs. Her eyes watered instantly. "David!" she called, voice muffled. A faint cough answered. She pushed forward past a wall of stacked grain bags toward the far corner, where a small form huddled beneath the ladder. The boy couldn't have been more than 9. His glasses were gone, and he was trembling both from fear and cold. "It's okay," she said, kneeling beside him. "I've got you." She wrapped her arms around him, pulled him close, and half dragged, half carried him toward the exit. The wood groaned overhead. Something heavy crashed behind them. She didn't look back. The moment they cleared the doorway, Thomas was there, hauling them both out. Emma collapsed in the snow, coughing hard, her eyes red and raw. The boy was crying, but alive. He clutched her sleeve like a lifeline. Someone handed her a canteen. Someone else threw a blanket over her shoulders. She barely registered the faces, just the sound of boots stomping, the crackle of collapsing timber, and Thomas's voice repeating her name. She nodded to show she was all right. Barely. The granary burned to the ground. Later, when the fire was nothing but a glowing pile of embers and the air reeked of wet ash and scorched wheat, the townspeople gathered in a loose circle. No one spoke at first. Then Mrs. Parker stepped forward. "Emma saved that boy's life," she said without thinking of her own. Heads nodded. Even the Reverend, normally reserved, looked at Emma with awe. "She didn't have to," he said, "but she did like she's done time and again." Someone started clapping, then someone else. And then the whole circle, the whole town stood clapping in the freezing snow, the fire still smoldering behind them. Emma didn't cry, not then, but she held David's hand tight. That night, Thomas stayed close. He didn't say much, just made tea, stoked the fire, and placed the wooden heart Sarah had made for her on the table like a token. The children were asleep in the corner on a quilt Mary had brought over. When the quiet settled, Thomas sat across from her and reached across the table. "You didn't have to run in." Emma looked at him. "Neither did you last spring when they were lost." He nodded slowly. "You could have died." "So could you." They sat in silence for a moment, firelight dancing across their faces. "I can't imagine this place without you anymore," he said. "I don't want to." She let the words settle before answering. "I think I've stopped imagining myself anywhere else." The next morning, people began bringing supplies, blankets, grain, tools to help rebuild. Emma, still sore from smoke and bruises, organized a team of women to start sewing new bedding for the families that lost theirs. By the end of the week, the cottage was filled with laughter and the smell of stew. Children played in the yard. Women traded stories over quilt squares. Mary pulled Emma aside one afternoon, her eyes twinkling. "When I first met you, I figured you'd leave. Smart girl like you, too good for this dust bowl, but you stayed." "I didn't expect to," Emma admitted, "but I found more here than I ever had before." Mary patted her arm. "It's not always about finding the perfect place. It's about becoming someone who belongs." That night, Thomas returned from the fields, his coat dusted with frost. He came into the cottage, shook off the cold, and reached into his pocket. He pulled out the ring. "I know you said spring," he said, voice steady, "but after everything, I'd rather ask now and wait for your yes than never ask at all." Emma stared at the simple band, her fingers twitched. "Ask me then?" she whispered. He stepped closer, took her hand, and said, "Will you marry me, Emma Davis? Not because I need you, not because this town needs you, but because I love you." She took a long breath, the fire crackling behind them, the weight of the last year settling in her chest like something holy. "Not yet," she said softly, "but soon?" He smiled, and this time he didn't look wounded or disappointed. He looked patient, hopeful, and when he left that night, he kissed her hand slow and reverent and said, "That's enough for me." Outside, the wind picked up again, but it didn't sound like a warning. It sounded like a beginning. The first signs of spring came not with flowers, but with sound. The rush of the river breaking its ice, the creak of thawing trees, the distant clatter of hooves against softening roads. It had been a long winter, but Clearview breathed again. Emma stood at the edge of the garden behind the cottage, sleeves rolled to her elbows, hands sunk deep into the warming earth. Shoots of green had begun pushing through, herbs mostly, and the first hopeful glimpse of a wild tomato vine. She wiped her brow with the back of her wrist and looked up as Sarah came bounding across the field. "You promised today," Sarah called. Emma smiled. "Did I?" "You said when the snow melted." "It's melted." The girl grinned, missing a front tooth now, a reminder of how fast time was moving. She was taller, bolder, and her laughter no longer held the ache it used to. Emma wiped her hands on her apron. "All right, go fetch your brother and tell your father to meet me by the old maple." She didn't need to say which one. Thomas would know. An hour later, Emma stood at the base of the broad tree behind the barn, her boots in the grass, her hands clasped loosely in front of her. The sun was warm on her shoulders. Thomas arrived with Jake balanced on one hip and Sarah tugging him along by the hand. He looked the same, and he didn't. There were still the deep-set eyes, the quiet steadiness, but something inside him had softened in the months since he'd first offered her a place. He walked differently now, as if the weight he carried had found a better place to rest. They stopped a few feet away, the children fidgeting between them. "You're right," Emma said, looking at Sarah. "I did promise." Thomas raised an eyebrow. "Promise what?" "That I'd answer." She reached into her pocket and pulled out the ring. The children gasped in unison. "I kept it," she said. "Not as a maybe, but as a reminder that I had the right to wait, to choose." Thomas nodded slowly, and Emma stepped forward. "I choose yes." Sarah whooped. Jake giggled and threw his arms around Emma's waist. Thomas didn't move at first, then he reached for her hand, taking it gently, as if he still wasn't sure he was allowed to hold something so steady. "You mean it?" "I've never meant anything more." They didn't marry in the church. They didn't need to. Instead, they stood under the old maple 3 days later with Reverend Brown and a circle of neighbors, friends, and children with fists full of wild flowers. Mary stood beside Emma and handed her a shawl she'd crocheted herself, saying, "This isn't to make you a wife. It's to honor the woman you were before you ever said yes." The ceremony was short. There were no grand words, no poetry, just truth. Just two people who had earned each other day by day, season by season. Afterward, Thomas and Emma led the children back to the cottage hand in hand. Supper was stew and warm bread. The table was full. Laughter came easy. When the sun dipped below the ridge, Thomas stood behind Emma on the porch as she watched the garden. His arms wrapped around her waist and his chin rested lightly on her shoulder. "Feels different," he murmured. "It should not because of the vows," he added. "Because of the story that came before them." Emma nodded. "And because we wrote it ourselves." A few weeks later, the townspeople gathered to raise a new granary. Emma stood shoulder to shoulder with men and women alike, hammer in hand, sweat on her brow. Mary manned the food table. Sarah passed out lemonade. Jake tried to nail 2 boards together and got his fingers stuck. No one called her that mail-order bride anymore. Now she was Miss Emma, then Mrs. Fletcher, then just Emma again, someone whose name was spoken with respect, not out of duty but affection, someone who had once arrived with a suitcase and an uncertain heart, and who now knew every creek bend and back road like it was drawn from her own blood. She never stopped working. The sewing business thrived. The garden expanded. She began teaching more girls to read on Sundays, and Thomas never stopped surprising her, whether with a new fence post carved just so or an extra cup of tea set beside hers before she even sat down. Years later, when asked how she and Thomas came to be, Emma would laugh and say, "I came here to marry a stranger and ended up choosing a friend." But that day never came in the form of fairy tale. It came in hard work, in standing up when it was easier to sit, in walking into a fire, in refusing a ring until the hand that offered it also held her truth. And in the end, she hadn't just become someone's wife. She had built a life. Now, Sarah fell asleep in her lap on the porch one evening, curled under the old crocheted shawl. Jake dozed nearby with a book half open on his chest. Thomas sat beside her, quietly sharpening a small carving knife, his hand steady, always steady. Emma looked out at the darkening sky, the moon just peeking above the hills. The air smelled of lilac and tilled earth. She leaned back, exhaled deeply, and whispered, not to anyone in particular, "I am home." And this time there was no more doubt.